Many thanks, Ed. It's a pretty difficult ask to follow Steve. He's touched on a lot of the points that I'm going to make in my talk. I probably won't make them quite as elegantly as he has or have the grace notes, but the advantage for you as an audience is I'm only going to be speaking for half the amount of time. So I don't have to convince anybody in the audience that the challenge that we're faced in understanding mental health, bringing together this complex coalition of our thoughts, dreams, beliefs, fears that really define who we are, is a really significant problem. And relating that to the mass of 1 billion neurons that sits between our ears is a really difficult challenge for us to follow, and fantastic that we have a group of committed people who are trying to unpick this complex role of genetics, the physical and social environments, and the way in which victories and scars from our lives affect our perspective and mental health. We know, looking at the recent history, that mental health as an area of research has been historically underinvested in. So these are some nice data put together by our colleagues at MQ, looking at both the prevalence and the costs of mental illness, and coming up with some really very stark numbers on the level of investment that we've had within the area of mental health relative to other conditions. So we're in a situation where we have to kind of come from behind, but I think there's a really good news story in that the societal context and the policy context has really shifted very radically in recent years. So we've seen in the UK, at least, I think this isn't a universal story. We can talk about lower and middle income settings in rather a different voice. But we've had some really important contributions from public figures, as well as, I think, some really exciting leading work from people like the Royals, who've done something really interesting, actually, not just raise mental health up the agenda to stimulate demand for services, but actually in raising mental health up the agenda, do that in such a way that's actually encouraging support mechanisms at peer level. I think their contribution, I think, has really been inspirational, actually. So we're in a good place in kind of the changing societal attitude. We've had a lot of discussion about reducing stigma, both in the ability of people to talk about it, but actually that stigma can also reflect into the way in which funding bodies have treated mental health conditions and policymakers. And actually, that story is also really very, very positive. There's huge amounts of energy and excitement about the topic of mental health within the UK and internationally. So we've seen important developments within the National Health Service. The Prime Minister is clearly personally committed to mental health as a topic of importance, and a number of recent important publications from UK government agencies, but also international agencies. So this is the World Health Organization, but other very, very significant international players are in very active discussions at the moment about putting mental health really at the very highest levels of international priority. So it's a really exciting time, I think, for the future of mental health. But if we're looking at this area, and I suppose my perspective, Wellcome's perspective, is very much as looking at the area of mental health as an opportunity to drive forward the area based on research, based on scientific research, based on that clear interlink between what's happening in this massive wet biology and the way in which mental health is being expressed. What are the kind of challenges that we need to think about and need to be able to overcome? And the next slide is deliberately a little bit crude and cartoonish, but it's just, I think, useful to remind ourselves of what we're facing. And as I said, Steve and others have touched on many of these already. But the significant problem that we have in the heterogeneity between individuals and the way in which we can pull out from those heterogeneous individuals particular clusters of symptoms and understand what they mean. The classification, actually, of the way in which we treat individual symptoms. We need to get to a better state than when we're classifying depression into 3 levels, which is mild, moderate, and severe. We need to be able to understand what are the different aspects of depression and really pull those out to understand how those can be linked up sufficiently well within individuals. And then we need to think about, well, what are the tools we have at our disposal? And again, this is kind of deliberately cartoonish, but Steve's hit this point really very, very clearly. We have a drug problem in terms of the level of innovation that is making its way all the way through to being applied to patients, and psychological therapies, which I will be talking quite a lot about, have clearly had some big improvements since 1905, but actually the general method of delivery we're still thinking about in a very, very similar way. And I guess underpinning all of this, from sort of taking a helicopter view of the whole of the research area, is that we're looking at a research base which is really way too fragmented, where we're looking at a number of small studies and where everybody has their favourite outcome measures. Steve didn't raise it in his talk. I like his analogy here that people are more willing to share a toothbrush than they are to share nomenclature. We need to get to a situation actually where we're able to talk about outcomes, we're able to talk about improvements or lack of improvements using a transparent and comparable set of scales. I'm going to talk about drugs very quickly. I got really bored of hearing people telling me that psychiatric drugs didn't work. I was really pleased at the publication of this recent review that really nails that one very, very clearly. But I think the whole of the field needs to kind of embrace this and shout about it a little bit more than we're currently doing. I quite like this paper in the British Journal of Psychiatry, which compared psychiatric drugs to other types of medical drugs, and made the point that actually the level of effectiveness we're seeing within psychiatric drugs is broadly consistent within other areas of medicine. If you go to cancer, you see actually better, more effective drugs. But psychiatric drugs really are not that bad when compared to other forms of medication. People with psychiatric conditions tend to be taking them for a whole lot longer because even though the mortality rate is lower for people with mental health conditions and mental health illnesses, it isn't as catastrophic as it is in some other areas of disease. So that's good news, but actually the bad news, and again this was alluded to in our discussion before, is that the pipeline has really constricted. So we've seen 70% disinvestment from the pharmaceutical industry in 10 years. That's a really big problem. That's a problem for patients. That's a really big problem for neuroscience, actually, because the type of drug discovery and the work that was being done within the pharmaceutical industry helped to underpin the health of the field of neuroscience. There are multiple causes. One of them is kind of reflected in this cartoon, which I quite like. But we've talked about this problem of the phenotypes. We've talked about the way in which we have restrictions in the animal models that are being used, and that is a significant barrier because we need to get to a place where the people who are enthusiastic about neuroscience within pharmaceutical companies, those people who still exist, will get a hearing when they go to speak to their senior managers to say, look, we've really got an opportunity to do something here. We think we can make a difference in this area. So a lot of kind of reflection and thinking about this, of my own thinking about this over the past year, is really addressing the question of, well, what can we do to try and get pharma back into this space? How can we stimulate and restructure the whole of the area so that pharmaceutical companies are seeing the opportunities that are there and can be used and exploited. I haven't got the golden answer for you, but I think it is going to take the collective efforts of multiple fields actually to try and drive that. But I think we have the opportunity to do that and think about the mechanisms that can bring back investment both in drug discovery but also stimulate investment in digital medications as well. So we need new biological targets. We're seeing some great discovery science which is giving us some handles on that. I'll actually be talking a little bit later on about sort of starting from the end and working backwards to try and come up with new biological targets. It's clear we need better translational paradigms for testing. So we move away from a mouse model of depression to thinking about the particular target, the particular active ingredient of for instance, psychological therapy, how that psychological therapy is changing the brain biology, what those processes are doing. And also a much better understanding of the phenotypes in order to get around this problem that we've been doing drug trials on groups of patients who are just way too different from each other. How we can get better stratification and hopefully, as Thalia was alluding to, come up with better predictions of who's going to benefit from new drug treatments. So that's kind of what we might think about from pharma. And then I guess there's also thinking about, well, what is it from the patient perspective that we should be thinking about and should be using. Clearly, we want better outcomes. They should be clinical, but they also need to be reflecting the social and economic outcomes that individual patients really care about, and bringing them on board. And actually, again, as Steve was alluding to, being able to learn from our patients. This has historically been a really important source of innovation and discovery. And so it's critical that we can bring patients along with us on this journey. And in doing this, in thinking about what are the data that we obtain, what are the measurements that we make, we need to be joined up. We need to be able to be in a situation where we can take data from multiple different studies, we can get over the toothbrush issue, and we can start to encourage people to be putting more of their data together. So there are a couple of recent initiatives just published in the last couple of years that have really talked about this drive to be able to come up with agreed standards, agreed common sets of measures, so that we can get everybody in international consortium contributing in a fair way. This isn't an easy thing to do. It's relatively easy to get all these people in a room and after the end of 2 years come up with a set of agreements. Actually, the really hard thing is to persuade people to drop their favourite measure and start adopting these ones. But I think that is a big challenge, but it's a really important one to try and address. Okay, so if we are looking for better outcomes, how do we get them? Well, we can think about better outcomes from new drugs, and we've talked about some possibilities for that. But we're slightly hamstrung by the fact that the pharmaceutical industry at the moment is not fully engaged in that. So I'm going to talk quite a bit in terms of psychological therapies and thinking about psychological therapies as a useful space for rapid innovation, actually more rapid than we can achieve with drugs at the present time. So how we can achieve better psychological therapies, and how actually not just thinking about how we implement a marginally better outcome at the end of a therapeutic intervention, but how we can build in scalability from the ground up so that we can meet the massive burden of mental health problems. Because we know that burden is significant within high-income contexts, but we actually know that the provision within low, middle and low-income contexts is much, much worse. So sort of 1 to 5 ratio in terms of need to treatment in high income settings versus a 1 to 27 ratio in low income settings. So thinking about the issues of scalability from the beginning are very important. So these are really big challenges, and speaking candidly, it's not going to be solved by psychiatrists alone. So we need to be thinking about this from a bigger perspective. We need to make sure that we are thinking about this as a scientific problem that we can bring the tools of empirical science to, where we are pulling together from multiple different areas. The interaction between the core interaction between psychiatry, clinical psychology, and neuroscience is one that I think can be a really, really important engine in this space of development. But there are a whole lot of other perspectives that can be valuable and can be usefully brought into this discussion to help solve what are very, very difficult problems. So I'm just going to lay out a little bit, lay out 4 challenges, and I'm going to mostly deal with 3. These 3 within the talk. But first, we need to be systematic, and we need to be using outcomes that can be compared transparently. We need to be able to learn from the outcomes in order to be able to refine psychological interventions. We need to be able to continue that historical tradition of being able to learn from our patients, so that we get the right vocabulary with which to describe mental health conditions. So how can we move beyond mild, moderate and severe depression to think about much more granular, differentiated understanding of these very complex conditions. The UK has got some really important innovations in this space already. We had a bit of a discussion about IAPT earlier on this morning, but this is a very recent paper from David Clark, but thinking about precisely this issue of how we ensure that we're getting transparency, how we ensure that we're actually being honest about the outcomes. We touched on this earlier in Bill's talk, but owning up to the cases where it's not working, because we have this tendency for a kind of optimism bias. I'm going to be talking about machine learning. In machine learning, it's really important to learn from both the successes and the failures. And multiple organizations are guilty of wanting to only think about the good outcomes, Wellcome included. I was giving an anecdote earlier. We have given some suitably anonymized data on our funding success rates for individual applicants. So this is with the approval of the applicants. These are data that we hold in terms of applicants that have come in through our funding pipeline to be decided on. And it was agreed that we could share the positive cases, but not the negative cases. That's not a good way of learning from those outcomes, actually. We need both sides. We need to have both sides of those. Okay, I'm going to tackle these, but I'm going to have a quick parenthetic detour into the rise of machines and the rise of machine learning, and talk to you a little bit about artificial intelligence and deep learning. And unless you've been under a rock for the last 5 years, those are terms that you're probably completely satiated with. But let's just think a little bit about the opportunities for looking at modern data analytic methods within the field of mental health. So here is a basic neural network. It has an input layer and it has an output layer. And in between that, there are some stuff that we can't see and we can't have access to. And we just have multiple connections between these layers. So that's a really basic neural network architecture that we've actually been living with for probably about 40 years. If that looks very familiar, then in a way it should do. Here's a diagram that I've adapted from a figure from one of Hubel and Wiesel's papers. that kind of reflects our thinking about deep neural networks at the moment. Here's our input layer, the receptor. Here's our output layer, some kind of muscle activity. And then we have these kind of hidden layers in between those things where it kind of gets progressively harder to work out what's going on. And that's certainly a big area of debate within the field of machine learning and deep learning at the moment, that we can construct these horrifically complicated multi-layered networks, and essentially we have no clue about what's happening in the middle of those things. So I mentioned that you'd have to be under a rock just to reinforce living under a rock, not to be hearing a lot about that, just to reinforce that point to you. Here is the current Gartner hype cycle. I don't know if everybody in the room is familiar with the Gartner hype cycle. This is a technology firm, and they talk about a range of different technologies in terms of different stages of development. It starts with the trigger innovation, it then reaches the peak of inflated expectations, it goes through the trough of disillusionment before we get the slope of enlightenment and the plateau of productivity, as they describe it. And every year, for a number of different sectors, they look at a range of different technologies within those sectors, and they describe them in terms of where they sit on this hype cycle. Things that start here don't necessarily end up here, and you might not be too surprised to learn that sitting right up there at the top is deep learning and machine learning. And we talked a little bit about fads earlier in science, so maybe we're risking being terribly faddish about this. I don't think we are. I think we have a real opportunity to use these techniques, but we need to be honest about this, actually, that this is currently a very trendy technique. And it's actually not a terribly novel one. The changes that have brought about this revolution in AI have been really quite subtle. And you might say, well, what's all the fuss about with all of this deep learning stuff? And I'm going to illustrate for you a little bit of a flavour of that fuss and show you the graph that changed the world. The place where this the use of these deep learning networks has really taken off, the original spark for that was in the field of visual object recognition, something I know a little bit about. And the challenge in visual object recognition is to be able to take some kind of crowded scene like this and then be able to work out all of the different components and label them appropriately so we can work out exactly what's happening within that scene. Of course, given these labels and that, you think, well, that's relatively easy, but of course, there are multiple different ways in which we can get very subtle variations in the form of an object. We can see it from different viewpoints, in different forms, and still recognize that a person who's occluded behind a waste paper bin or in front of something else is identifiably an individual person. So this problem has long been thought of as really hard. I argue it still is pretty hard, even though we've seen dramatic improvements in computer vision technologies. But actually this starting point used to be one that people studying the visual system would often make to say, look how amazing the human perceptual system is, computer systems can get nowhere near it. Well, all of that changed. So this is a graph of the performance on benchmarked object recognition systems. The winners of this is from a competition that's held every year, and there was a standard test set of images, and the task was for a computer to recognize what the contents of those images were, and that was quantified in terms of the error rate, as shown here. And this shows data for 2 years, but actually the rate of progress in this field over the preceding 10 was pretty much around this, was hovering around this level of activity here. So we're talking kind of maximum 25%. And it really hadn't changed. And then in 2012, along came a paper that was using methods that had been being talked about from at least the late 1980s that saw a 10% immediate step change in the performance of those algorithms. So we got a really big overnight shift in the ability to do object recognition. which then accelerated over the subsequent years, and to the extent that we currently have algorithms that on some benchmarks, not all of them, will exceed human performance in recognizing objects. The technology behind this, as I say, wasn't that new. They solved a few kind of handy little bits of mathematics, but the basic mechanism underlying this was to have a densely interconnected network, feed it some inputs, have some labels of what those inputs were at the output, run the activity through, work out whether the network was right or wrong, and then feed that back, that error signal back through the network in order to adjust the network and its connectivity. So there were some slight tweaks in the mathematics, but importantly, along came a big set of well-labeled data that had been obtained from people in the wild. And actually, this problem became a whole lot easier because there was a whole lot more labeled data. So suddenly we had enough ground truth data that we could be running thousands and thousands of images through these networks, learning about them, and then getting those predictions out at the end of it. So just to sort of really reinforce the point, here's a complex neural network with multiple deep hidden layers. We feed it some stuff at the beginning, we train it up, in this case on a whole lot of animals, and then we get to the end of this thing and then we give it the information about what, on a particular trial, what the instance of this thing, the stimulus that was shown was, the cat, for instance, and when we get to the label at the end that says cat, then we learn that's the correct thing, and dog is the wrong one. And we use that information to shape and form our network. Okay, so what are the lessons for machine learning in mental health? Again, I've alluded to the Gartner hype cycle. I've been in the job at Wellcome a year. I like to joke that if I was given £1 every time somebody enthusiastically came up and told me about their new app, I'd be well on my way to that luxury caravan. But there is a lot of hype and there's a lot of enthusiasm about the potential of harvesting passive data from wearable devices and smartphones. I think there is potential in that, but it needs to be followed up with other things. There are some really good apps out there that do useful things for people with chronic conditions, but apps as a general strategy are unlikely to be yielding a whole lot of data. And importantly, I didn't expect it to take that long, but colleagues not too far away from this building have shown the difficulties and the future difficulties of assuming that members of the public will be very happy to share all of their private data. So that for me was a real lesson in terms of thinking about this, that our assumptions, building a future that's based all about this is really, really difficult, because our assumptions about what people are prepared to share now are very unlikely to be true. And I find myself surprised that that's happened within 6 months. I was having discussions about this point in the autumn last year and said, within a few years we risk being in a digital desert. It's taken 6 months. So this is a note of important caution. What we really need is high quality validated data. And actually that points to a really critical role for clinicians within this space. What we want to be doing is collecting standardized measures that we've got some kind of agreement on, and I'm not giving specific ones, but we need to think about a wide range of metrics that we can obtain in a standardized way to give us the potential to learn from those data to understand the underlying issues within mental health problems. So standardized assessments and standardized outcomes, and actually potentially using, again in controlled settings under the assumptions of very strong patient consent, interventions that we can capture digitally and analyze them. So this, I think, leads us towards getting systematic and transparent outcomes. That is critical. We also, and again, this is the kind of Google point, we need the high quality labeled data. That's really, really critical. If you put junk into a complex algorithm, you're going to get junk out of it. We also need the scale. So here are the Manhattan plots. I've forgotten whether it was 256. I kind of like the symmetry of that number, or 280. But we're seeing that the scale is really, really critical. And when we're driving for that scale, we are not talking about saying, I've got a study here that's got one set of metrics. I've got a study here that's got another set of metrics. I can apply some transformation to put them into the same space, and then we can pull the data. If you do that and you run it through a machine learning algorithm, the easiest thing for your machine learning algorithm to pick out is the transformation that you just made. And by doing this, by getting this scale, what we want to be able to drive towards is, if you like, the kind of psychological elements that we're dealing with. And when we think about the kind of genetic elements, we sort of know what those are by now. But actually, the psychological elements are not that too difficult to understand at this point either. We have a starting point on those psychological elements. They look like this. And we need to be able to take those kind of complex psychological interventions that involve people talking to each other and interacting with each other, and then learn from those and abstract from them to understand what is that sequence of words doing in terms of changing the biology of a person's brain. So the way I structure my thinking, at least, about this in terms of what we do with this data, is we think about patient variables, we think about therapy variables, and we think about outcome variables. And what we have the opportunity to do is be using machine learning to understand these relationships between each other, to unpick what's happening here and the complex relations between these two. And again, we're thinking about this, if we're thinking about this within the context of learning from machine learning, it's all about the outcomes. It's about taking those outcomes, learning from them, the good and the bad, in order to drive our understanding of what's responsible for causing those things. So I think we have a real prospect, if we can do this at sufficient scale, of disaggregating different phenotypes, understanding the different natures of presentation that are coming to us in a systematic way, so we can pool all of those data together and move beyond kind of individual anecdote. As I've said, we need to be thinking really clearly about our outcomes. So rather than thinking about diagnosis goes to treatment goes to outcome, we actually want to turn that around and say, how can I combine that with learning from the outcomes to understand what the treatment was doing and what the initial diagnosis was at the beginning, which of course then gives us the opportunity to turn that into a virtuous circle. I'm getting there, Ed. The other point I want to make about psychological interventions is we need to think about these as empirical randomised events in which random stuff happens because we've got two people talking to each other and they're not following a script, or not necessarily following a very rigorous script. So we can think about a psychological intervention as a series of A, B, C, and D, but then we can take that into the wild and think about that actually happening, and imagine the situation where, well, in this case, actually D was omitted and E was inserted instead, or we got a repetition of B in the wrong place, or a reordering. And so that's the content, but it's also the timing, about thinking about exactly when things happened. And if we've captured this, we have the opportunity to learn from it and distill down from it, so we understand what are the right units of the delivery of a therapy. What is that therapeutic action? Why is it critical that things go in a particular direction? So identifying those key ingredients, both in terms of content and the timing of delivery, because we know that the underlying neurobiology is time sensitive, is important. So I think that's an opportunity to lead to a transformation, and the kind of analogy for that is thinking about driving a car, where I used to have a paper copy of a map sitting in the back of the car that occasionally I'd need to resort to. Nowadays, I guess I very frequently would rely on the navigation system to assist me in the task of driving, and it's not too far beyond until we get to the point where we're thinking probably not about fully autonomous driving cars, but actually driving systems in cars which are doing a lot more of the driving with the person still at the wheel. And that's an opportunity actually to be thinking about delivering therapies in that way through a computer-assisted technology in order to maximize the therapeutic benefits. And then the final point I think if we've done this, if we've understood what's happening, what the contexts are, what the individual people are, that gives us a really useful stimulus for driving backwards from understanding, from doing our discovery at the human level to driving backwards in this pathway to understand what are the biological actions. How can we study those processes within a rat model so we really get an understanding of the biology, again, moving us away from the depression in a rat, but it's that I'm interested in that particular therapeutic process within an animal model. So I've talked about a range of challenges, I think how we can address them, and I'm going to very quickly, Ed, end with just a note of caution on the use of AI technology and making sure that we're thinking about it in the right way. Here is a nice image. Most people who look at this image say it's Mary Poppins. Very quickly, in fact, they're making a really complex inference. If you show this image to a state-of-the-art computer vision system, it will tell you that its first best guess is a guitar plectrum, and its second best guess is a toilet seat. The real object that gave rise to that image was actually this complex thing here. So we can't fool ourselves that machines are going to solve it all. They need to be done in interaction with human brains, but I think we have an opportunity. And there's also, final point, there's also an opportunity for the field of machine learning and AI, I think, to learn from the rich experience that we get in the field of mental health. So this is a neural network. That's a neuron within a neural network. That's kind of what we think of as a pyramidal cell within neuroscience. Actually, those things together, as those elements are as kind of similar as that is to a person. Understanding that AI works with a huge energy budget and the human brain does it on the energy budget of a light bulb is a really important challenge in AI, and actually thinking about the places in which brains go wrong and understanding that the chemical basis of that signaling can be something useful for machine learning. Psychiatric, the withdrawal of psychiatrists had implications for the whole field. There was a time within the history of neuroscience where all the good people were being snapped up by the pharmaceutical industry. A similar thing is happening at the moment within AI. There is a cautionary note there that in 10 years there might be a whole lot of AI industrialists who are looking for new homes.